Chester was a big pig who lived on Tobias Marsh's ranch. For 3 whole days, Chester kept digging in the same spot in his pen. He wasn't just playing around like pigs usually do. He was digging like he was looking for something really important. Tobias had built his ranch 20 years ago with his wife Ruth, but now Ruth was gone and it was just him and his animals. Chester was driving him crazy because the pig had dug a hole 3 feet deep in the corner of his pen. Every time Tobias filled it back up, Chester would go right back to that exact same spot and start digging again. Chester's nose was all scraped up from digging against rocks and roots. He barely ate his food anymore and spent all day digging. His friend Dolly, another pig, stayed far away and watched nervously. Tobias tried everything to stop Chester. He moved the food to the other side of the pen and even put up a fence around the hole, but Chester just pushed through and kept digging. What was weird was how Chester always went to the exact same spot every time. Other pigs dig randomly, following their noses wherever smells take them, but Chester returned to the same square foot of dirt like something was calling to him from underground. Tobias had been raising pigs for 23 years and had never seen anything like this. His wife Ruth used to say animals could sense things humans couldn't, like earthquakes or storms. But what could Chester be sensing 6 feet underground? One day, when Tobias was about to go back to his house, he heard something that made him stop. Chester had stopped digging and was making a low, sad sound. It wasn't like a normal pig grunt or squeal. It sounded almost like crying. Chester was staring right at Tobias like he was trying to tell him something really important. That afternoon, Tobias decided to help Chester dig. He grabbed a shovel and climbed into the pen. The hole was deeper than he thought and perfectly round, showing Chester had been digging carefully, not randomly. The dirt felt different here, looser than the hard clay on the rest of his property. Like someone had dug here before. When Tobias pushed his shovel into the bottom of the hole, it went deeper than expected. Chester watched every move and seemed to approve. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something that wasn't dirt or rock. It was soft but pushed back. Tobias's heart started beating fast as he cleared away the dirt. A piece of old blue fabric came up from the earth. It looked like part of a shirt that had been buried for years. Chester went completely quiet and stood perfectly still, watching Tobias work. Even the chickens and horses seemed to know something was happening. When Tobias lifted the fabric, his fingers touched something smooth and curved underneath. He cleared away more dirt and found himself looking at human rib bones. Chester hadn't been digging randomly. The pig had somehow found human remains buried under his pen. Tobias sat back, his mind racing. This ranch had belonged to his family. For 3 generations, his grandfather built the original house, his father expanded it, and Tobias inherited it. There were no records of anyone being buried here, no family cemetery, nothing that would explain human bones on his property. But someone was definitely down there, and from the looks of the old fabric, they'd been there for a very long time. Chester made a soft grunt and stepped closer to the hole, like he was asking Tobias to keep digging. The pig's eyes looked so smart that it made Tobias uncomfortable. It was almost like Chester knew exactly who was buried there. Tobias went to his house with shaking hands and poured himself some whiskey. He pulled out old photo albums his wife had kept, looking for any clue about his family's history. His grandfather Jonas had started the ranch in 1891. His father Samuel had worked it until he died 10 years ago. 3 generations of his family, and none had ever mentioned anyone being buried on the property. But as Tobias looked through old photographs, one picture stopped him cold. It was from 1923 and showed his grandfather standing with several other men. One man looked familiar, though Tobias couldn't remember where he'd seen that face. The man was tall and thin, wearing the same style blue shirt Tobias had just pulled from the grave. On the back of the photo, someone had written names in pencil. Jonas, Samuel, Marcus Webb, Theodore Pike. Tobias had never heard the name Marcus Webb before, but something about it felt important. He went back to the pen as the sun set. Chester was lying beside the hole like he was keeping watch. When he saw Tobias coming, the pig stood up and moved aside. Tobias kept digging with more purpose now. The bones were definitely human and arranged like someone had been placed there on purpose. This wasn't someone who died and was properly buried. This was someone who had been hidden. As he carefully removed more dirt, Tobias found other things mixed in with the bones: a leather belt with a silver buckle, old boots, and something that made his blood run cold. A small metal star that was tarnished but clearly recognizable as a sheriff's badge. The badge was engraved Sheriff Marcus Webb, and dated 1923, the same year as the photograph. The same man who had stood with his grandfather, wearing the same blue shirt that was now wrapped around his bones. Tobias looked at Chester, who was watching with those smart eyes. Somehow, this pig had led him to discover that a sheriff from 1923 was buried on his family's land. But sheriffs don't just disappear and get buried in secret. They get murdered. And if Marcus Webb had been killed and buried here, that meant someone in his family knew about it. Chester made that sad sound again, and this time Tobias understood. The pig wasn't just digging randomly. Chester had found a murder that someone had tried very hard to keep buried. But the most scary part wasn't what Chester had found. It was what finding it meant about his own family's past. Tobias spent all night looking through every document his family had left behind. Birth certificates, property papers, tax records, anything that might explain why Sheriff Marcus Webb was buried on their land. The more he searched, the more questions he had. According to county records, Marcus Webb had been reported missing in September 1923. The official report said he disappeared while looking into cattle stealing in the area. His body was never found, and the case went cold. But Tobias now knew exactly where Webb had ended up. What bothered him most were the dates. Webb disappeared on September 15, 1923, according to his grandfather's journal. That was the exact same day Jonas Marsh suddenly got a lot of money, enough to buy additional land that doubled the size of their ranch. The journal said, "The Webb matter is settled. We can move forward now." 3 days later, he bought more land. Our troubles are behind us. Tobias felt sick as he realized what this meant. His grandfather hadn't just known about Webb's disappearance. He had been involved in it, and that involvement had made the family wealthy enough to expand their ranch significantly. When morning came, Tobias returned to the pen. Chester was waiting, standing guard over the grave. But something had changed overnight. The pig was no longer focused on the hole. Instead, Chester kept looking toward the old barn that had been on the property since his grandfather's time. Following Chester's look, Tobias went to the barn and started searching areas he'd never paid attention to before. In the loft, behind old hay, he found a metal box that had been hidden for decades. Inside were documents that made his hands shake as he read them. Sheriff Webb hadn't been looking into cattle stealing when he disappeared. He'd been investigating his own deputy, Theodore Pike, the other man in the photograph, for taking bribes from cattle thieves. According to Webb's notes, Pike had been working with local ranchers to cover up the thefts, including Jonas Marsh. But the worst document was a letter Webb had written but never sent, addressed to a higher-up marshal. In it, he detailed his evidence against Pike and Jonas Marsh, saying he planned to arrest both men on September 15, 1923. The letter was dated September 14. Webb had come to arrest his grandfather and instead ended up buried in what would become Chester's pen. Jonas Marsh and Theodore Pike had murdered a lawman to protect their criminal business, then used the money to buy more land and make their operations look legal. Tobias looked back toward the pen where Chester continued watching. The pig had somehow sensed the unfairness buried under the dirt and had spent days trying to bring it to light. 100 years of silence broken by a pig who refused to let the dead stay hidden. But as Tobias held the evidence of his family's dark past, he faced an impossible choice. He could report what he found and expose his grandfather's crimes, destroying the reputation his family had built over generations. Or he could rebury the truth and let Chester's efforts be wasted. Chester was watching him from across the yard, and Tobias could swear the animal was waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be. Would he honor the law that Webb had died trying to uphold, or would he protect the reputation built on that lawman's murder? The pig made that sad sound again, and this time it sounded like a plea for justice that had been waiting 100 years to be heard. Tobias sat on his porch for hours, staring at the documents that could destroy everything his family had built. The weight of a 100-year-old murder pressed down on him. Every board under his feet, every fence post around his property, every improvement his father and grandfather had made, all of it paid for with blood money. Chester had come over and now lay at the bottom of the porch steps, his big head resting on his front legs. The pig's eyes never left Tobias's face, like he understood how big this decision was. The smart thing would be to burn the evidence and rebury Webb's remains somewhere far from the ranch. No one else knew what Chester had found. The sheriff's case had been cold for 100 years. No one was coming to look for answers now. Tobias could protect his family's reputation and keep the ranch that had been his whole life. But every time he looked at Chester, he remembered that sad cry. Webb had died trying to do the right thing, and his killer had gotten rich. For 100 years, the lawman's body had lain in an unmarked grave, while Jonas Marsh's name was honored throughout the county as a respected rancher and founding father. Tobias thought about Ruth, who had always believed in justice over convenience. She would have told him to do the right thing no matter what it cost. But Ruth wasn't here to face the consequences. She wasn't here to watch their life's work fall apart because of sins committed before they were born. As the sun reached its highest point, Tobias found himself walking back to the pen. Chester immediately stood up and joined him at the edge of the grave. Together, they looked down at the remains of Marcus Webb, the sheriff who had tried to bring criminals to justice and paid with his life. Tobias knelt beside the grave and carefully lifted Webb's badge, feeling its weight in his hand. The metal was cold, but somehow it seemed to pulse with the authority the man had carried in life. This wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of everything Webb had stood for. Chester made a soft grunt and stepped closer, pressing his nose gently against Tobias's shoulder. The gesture felt almost like comfort, as if the pig understood how hard the choice was, but also knew what needed to be done. Tobias looked around his ranch, the land that had supported 3 generations of his family, the home where he'd planned to live out his days, all of it built on a foundation of murder and corruption. How could he continue to benefit from a crime that had destroyed a good man's life? But as he stood up, badge in hand, Tobias noticed something else in the grave that he'd missed before. Tucked under Webb's rib cage was a small leather pouch. And from what Tobias could see, it contained more than just personal things. Whatever was in that pouch might hold secrets that went far beyond his grandfather's involvement in the sheriff's death. Chester was staring at the pouch too, and his expression had changed from sad to urgent. The pig knew there was more to discover. With shaking hands, Tobias carefully took the leather pouch from under Webb's remains. The material was well preserved by the clay soil, and when he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside weren't just personal things. There were photographs, documents, and what looked like a detailed map of the entire county. The photographs showed things that made Tobias's stomach turn. Pictures of cattle with brands that had been changed, groups of men loading stolen livestock onto trains, and most damning of all, clear pictures of Theodore Pike and Jonas Marsh directing the operations. Webb hadn't just been investigating small-time cattle stealing. He'd uncovered a massive organized theft ring that stretched across 3 counties. But it was the map that made everything clear. Red X's marked locations throughout the territory with dates and numbers written beside each one. Tobias recognized several locations as ranches that had belonged to his grandfather's business partners, men who had mysteriously gotten rich during the same time Jonas Marsh had expanded his holdings. At the bottom of the pouch was a list of names, and Tobias's blood ran cold as he read them. These weren't just local ranchers. They included the territorial governor, the federal marshals, and the railroad commissioner. Webb had discovered that the cattle stealing operation was being protected at the highest levels of government. Chester pressed closer, as if sensing how big this discovery was. This wasn't just about his grandfather's crimes anymore. Webb had died because he'd found corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. His murder hadn't just silenced one honest lawman. It had allowed an entire network of criminals to continue operating for decades. Among the documents was Webb's final report, written in careful handwriting and addressed to the U.S. Marshal Service in Denver. In it, he detailed how stolen cattle were being moved through a network of corrupt officials, sold to government contractors, and the profits shared among everyone from local ranchers to territorial politicians. The operation was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune in 1923. But what horrified Tobias most was realizing that the corruption hadn't ended with Webb's death. Looking at the names on the list, he recognized family names that still held power in the county today. Descendants of the original conspirators now served as mayors, judges, and business leaders. The network Webb had died trying to expose had simply evolved and continued. As he studied the map more carefully, Tobias noticed something that made his heart race. Several of the marked locations matched areas where other ranchers had reported finding human remains over the years, discoveries that had been quickly dismissed by local authorities as old Indian burial grounds or forgotten graves from the territorial period. Webb hadn't been the only person murdered to protect this conspiracy. The map suggested at least 6 other locations where bodies might be buried, all marked with dates between 1923 and 1925. The cattle-stealing ring had eliminated anyone who posed a threat, and the evidence had been scattered across the territory. Chester made that urgent sound again and began walking toward the barn. When Tobias followed, the pig led him to a section of floor that looked different from the rest, newer boards that had clearly been replaced at some point. Chester began pawing at the boards just as he had done at the grave site. Tobias pried up the loose boards and found another hiding place containing a metal-strong box. Inside were stacks of money, more cash than Tobias had ever seen in one place. But it wasn't modern money. These were bills and coins from the 1920s, apparently Webb's evidence of the payoffs that kept the conspiracy working. A note attached to the money was written in his grandfather's handwriting, "Payment for services rendered." The Webb problem is permanent. T. Pike sends his regards. The date was September 16, 1923, one day after Webb's disappearance. Tobias now understood the full scope of what Chester had uncovered. His grandfather hadn't just participated in cattle stealing and murder. He had been paid handsomely to help cover up the crimes. The expansion of their ranch hadn't been funded by honest success, but by blood money from a conspiracy that had claimed multiple lives. And somewhere out there, the descendants of the other conspirators were still benefiting from wealth built on the foundation of murder and corruption, completely unaware that a pig named Chester had just exposed the truth they thought was buried forever. Tobias spent the next morning making copies of every document, photograph, and piece of evidence Webb had gathered. He photographed the badge, the money, and even the map with its damning red X's marking burial sites across the county. If he was going to expose this conspiracy, he needed to make sure the evidence couldn't be destroyed or dismissed. Chester followed him everywhere, as if understanding that his discovery had set something big in motion. The pig's behavior had returned to normal in every way except one. He refused to leave Tobias's side, as though he sensed danger approaching. That afternoon, Tobias drove into town to visit the County Historical Society. He needed to verify the names on Webb's list and understand how many of the families mentioned still held power in the area. What he discovered made his decision inevitable. The elderly historian was eager to help when Tobias mentioned researching his family's history, but when he showed her photocopies of some names from Webb's documents, her expression changed dramatically. "Where did you find these names together?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Old family papers," Tobias replied carefully. "Why?" She looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "My grandfather used to tell stories about a corruption scandal in the 1920s. Sheriff Webb was getting close to exposing something big when he disappeared. But anyone who tried to investigate further seemed to have accidents or decided to leave town suddenly." She pulled out a thick folder from a locked cabinet. "I've been researching this for years, but I never had enough evidence to prove anything. These families you're asking about, their descendants still run this county. The current mayor, the police chief, the county commissioners, even the district attorney, they're all descended from people on your list." Tobias felt the weight of Webb's badge in his pocket. The conspiracy hadn't just survived. It had evolved into a political dynasty that controlled local law enforcement and government. Exposing the truth wouldn't just reveal historical crimes. It would threaten the power structure that had ruled the county for a century. "There's something else," she whispered. 3 people have tried to research this story in the past 20 years. One had a car accident, one moved away after receiving threats, and one simply disappeared. If you're thinking of pursuing this, you need to be very careful about who you trust." As Tobias drove home, he noticed a black truck following him at a distance. When he turned onto his ranch road, the truck continued past, but he caught a glimpse of the driver, a man wearing a police uniform. Someone was already watching him. That evening, as he sat on his porch reviewing the evidence one last time, Tobias heard vehicles approaching. 3 trucks pulled into his yard and men climbed out, men he recognized as local businessmen and officials. Leading them was Police Chief Raymond Pike, great-grandson of Theodore Pike, the corrupt deputy who, had helped murder Webb. Evening, Tobias, Chief Pike called out, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Heard you've been asking questions about old family history. Mind if we have a chat? Chester emerged from behind the house, positioning himself between Tobias and the visitors. The pig's body language was unmistakably threatening, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling from his throat. Even in the face of armed men, Chester was ready to protect the man who had listened to his warnings. "We know what you found," Pike continued, stepping closer, "and we know you've been making copies." "That was a mistake, Tobias. A big mistake." Tobias stood slowly, feeling Webb's badge in his pocket and thinking about the lawman who had died trying to expose these same families a century ago. History was repeating itself, but this time, there was a witness who couldn't be silenced. The entire county would soon know the truth because Tobias had already mailed copies of everything to newspapers and law enforcement agencies outside the county's influence. "Too late," Tobias said simply. "The truth is already out there." Pike's expression darkened as he realized he was facing the same situation his great-grandfather had faced in 1923. But unlike Webb, Tobias had prepared for this moment, and Chester wasn't going to let another good man disappear without a fight. The standoff lasted only moments before the sound of sirens filled the air. Federal agents and state investigators poured onto the ranch, surrounding Pike and his men before they could react. Tobias had spent the morning not just making copies, but calling every law enforcement agency outside the county's influence. Pike's face went pale as he realized the trap had closed around him. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled. "Do you know how many families you're going to destroy?" "I know exactly what I've done," Tobias replied, pulling Webb's badge from his pocket. "I've given Marcus Webb the justice he died trying to achieve." The federal agents moved quickly, arresting Pike and his associates while securing the evidence Tobias had gathered. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, who led the team, examined Webb's documents with growing amazement. "This is the most complete evidence of historical corruption we've ever encountered," she told Tobias. "Your pig didn't just find a murder victim. He uncovered what might be the longest-running criminal conspiracy in territorial history." Chester watched the proceedings with what could only be described as satisfaction. As the corrupt officials were led away in handcuffs, the pig returned to his pen and laid down peacefully for the first time in weeks. His work was finally done. The investigation that followed made national headlines. Webb's evidence led to the discovery of 6 more burial sites across 3 counties, exactly as his map had indicated. DNA testing confirmed the identities of several victims, other law enforcement officers, journalists, and honest officials who had threatened the conspiracy over the years. Mayor Patricia Kellerman, District Attorney Robert Morrison, and 12 other officials were arrested as the investigation expanded. The network Webb had died trying to expose finally crumbled under the weight of evidence a pig had refused to let stay buried. The trials lasted 2 years and resulted in dozens of convictions. Property seized from the conspiracy was worth millions of dollars, wealth accumulated over a century of corruption. Much of it was returned to the families of victims or donated to law enforcement training programs. Tobias faced a difficult choice about his ranch, which had been expanded using blood money. After long consideration, he donated the additional land his grandfather had purchased with Webb's murder money to establish the Marcus Webb Memorial Park, complete with a proper grave for the sheriff and monuments to all the conspiracy's victims. Chester lived out his days as something of a celebrity, featured in newspapers and television programs as the pig who solved a century-old murder. Visitors came from across the country to meet the animal who had refused to let injustice stay buried. Chester seemed to enjoy the attention, though he never again showed any interest in digging. Tobias kept a smaller portion of the original ranch and continued farming, but his life had changed completely. He became an advocate for cold case investigations and worked with law enforcement agencies to solve other historical crimes. The experience had taught him that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen when someone, even a pig, is trying to tell you something important. Years later, when people asked him how he'd found the courage to expose his own family's crimes, Tobias would always credit Chester. "He showed me that some truths are too important to stay buried," he would say, "and that justice doesn't have an expiration date." Chester lived to be 14 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep. When they buried him, Tobias placed a small replica of Webb's badge beside him, It seemed fitting that the pig who had brought a murdered lawman justice should carry a badge of honor into whatever comes after this life. The Marcus Webb case became a model for investigating historical corruption, and Chester's story inspired dozens of cold case reopenings across the country. Sometimes justice takes a century to arrive, but it arrives nonetheless, especially when you have a determined pig who refuses to give up digging for the truth.